consequences. The one thing that we don't really like, because a lot of times, even if we've learned our lesson or grown from it, we still have to live those consequences. The resurrection of Moses. Yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil when he disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring against him a reveling accusation, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." In this lesson, the last lesson of the year, the last lesson of Deuteronomy, we're now looking at Moses, the person who was basically the central figure of all of this, because he was the one presenting God's word to them. He was the one that was guiding them all the way here. But it's a sad and happy story, because basically Israel is now at the end. They're looking at the promised land and Moses can't enter. And so the consequence of Moses' action was he was there when they wanted water because they didn't have water, and he put himself in God's position by saying basically that he was with God providing the water. So here, this is a difficult situation for Moses because he did sin. But why? Why was it so important? I want to look at this quote on Sunday to start thinking about this. The problem wasn't so much his anger itself, which was bad enough, but understandable, but when he said, "Must we bring water for you out of this rock?" As if he or any human being could bring water out of a rock. Now, this is where it's important to understand. Israel, right, they've been guided by Moses. He was their leader, but he wasn't actually the one guiding them. He was a messenger for God because God was the one guiding them. And why is this sin so big? And why does it change, right, the final chapter of the life of Moses? It's because right here, Israel had gotten a glimpse into maybe seeing Moses as the leader and the person to be blamed for all these decisions instead of God. Now, when I say blame, I don't actually mean that it was the fault of anyone. It was what Israel was seeing and feeling, but they were finally realizing at this moment that it was their fault that Moses had sinned. Why? If Moses had not been punished and judgment hadn't been set that way, which was he couldn't enter the promised land, that would have changed the way Israel saw God and Moses and how they were led to this point. So I want to think about that, which is you're so close to the promised land. Why then was the punishment was that Moses couldn't get in? Why? Well, remember, Moses at that moment of sinning was in a way putting himself as Israel's leader. And so by God saying he can't enter the promised land, now they don't have Moses, they have God who is leading them. And that allows them to understand that all along it was God and still God pushing them forward. But it also reminds them that they were the ones that pushed Moses to be frustrated. And now they lost the person who was being used by God to guide them in. And it was their fault. So it makes them recognize their sin and to put into perspective what they were doing. So remember, one thing to think about is how all these things shape us. Because when we read this, we start realizing something. We are all representatives of God. If someone is looking at us, if someone is being taught by us, whatever we're doing, as Christians, they're looking to us as examples. Especially now with the pandemic, with things that are happening, we are examples of how we should act for God. How is God going to guide us? How would God be doing the things that we are doing? Are we doing it correctly or not? Because are we showing love? Are we showing those things? Because if we're not, we're falsely or in a wrong way representing what God would want us to do. So that's why it's vital. And seeing this here, right, it kind of makes us understand a bit better because it feels like a harsh punishment. But remember, Moses, again, he was resurrected. And so with that context, we understand that God didn't want to do this, but because of what happened, he had to use this as a lesson. A lot of times, the decisions that we make, the way that we act, basically all of that is pointing to how we are representing God or not. It points to how we are pushing forward His being who God is and representing Him. So we can't, in good conscience, just think that we can get away with things. We have to look to Him. And when Moses didn't, as a leader who had that much more of an importance, right? And again, not that he was completely leading them, but he was being used by God to lead them. That is a very high position to be in. And so for all of us, the positions that we're in when representing, it comes with that weight and responsibility that we need to understand how we affect others. And so especially now when we're thinking about this, when it is the time for thinking of, Jesus and His birth, resurrection, everything for His life, right? And that salvation, remember that we are serving also as examples to others around us, that they are watching and seeing how we represent God. And if we're only claiming to be following God and not doing it, like many times Israel did, we might be actually causing more problems for ourselves because we're causing problems for them. So I wanted to think about this quote because it's a happy ending in a way, but it shows how important it is for all of us and the way that we are living our lives. So look at this quote of Moses when he finally actually, at the very end, landed in Israel. Upon the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses was present with Elijah, who had been translated. They were sent as bearers of light and glory from the Father to His Son. And thus the prayer of Moses, uttered so many centuries before, was at last fulfilled. He stood upon the goodly mountain within the heritage of his people, bearing witness to Him in whom all the promises to Israel centered. Such is the last scene revealed to mortal vision in the history of that man, so highly honored of heaven. Here is Moses, all of that time wanting to enter the promised land. He did get something better, which was the resurrection, to basically be free, right, from the sin and all of this. But here was that moment where Moses finally entered into the promised land, and you kind of see that chapter ending for what he always wanted, right? But to look at His death and resurrection, we have to think about that, right? He saw Israel go in, and he saw everything happening, and he understood, right, what that message was that he was giving them, that they hopefully would follow God, and the purpose of it with the Messiah coming through them, dying, resurrecting, and giving further hope through that next chapter. And here Moses is actually helping Jesus at that moment where that chapter is going to turn, and he's doing it in that promised land finally. But it's also right before Israel officially takes a stand for the wrong side as a nation, and it passes over. So because of that, remember for yourselves the decisions that you're making. If you're being used by God and you're not following Him, there is an understanding by God, but there are those consequences. And why? Because the decisions that we make, it is going to reflect to other people. If God just said, okay, you didn't do it, but it's fine, people would not understand. The same way if Moses had just been, it's fine, go in, Israel would always think Moses was actually the one leading them. And they would lose sight of God and everything it said. So at that moment, it hinged on all of that. And so just like that, the things that we decide to do and how we represent God, there's a lot of weight to that. So remember it, especially at ending this year, think about the actions that you're making and how it's representing God or not. Because it's better to do things for God than to do them for ourselves, so we can give people that beautiful message, that better chance, but more importantly, so that we can also receive those blessings and benefits for ourselves.